Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus. Before we start, I have a sad announcement to make. Phyllis Zimler Miller, who co founded this show and with whom I co hosted more than 200 episodes, passed away on June 11. She leaves a big void in her family as a writer about the Holocaust and other Jewish subjects, and as my co host in this show. We will continue this podcast as a part of her legacy. Our condolences and thoughts go out to her husband, her children, and to her wider family. We will start now with today's episode. There is a dangerously popular discourse in Western academia and on social media that delegitimizes this Jewish state, the Jewish state. I have the honor to talk today with a renowned scholar of the roots of this trend, Isabella Taborowski. She is a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism, and the author of Be a Refusenik, a Jewish student's survival guide. She's a fellow with the Kamper Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism and Racism at the University of Haifa and the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. And she is a senior fellow with the Z3 Institute in Palo Alto. Her writings have been published in Newsweek, Tablet, Forward, Times of Israel, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and other media outlets. Isabella, thank you so much for coming on Never Again Is Now podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Evelyn. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, your research exposed that the allegations we hear against Zionism, that it is racist, colonial, and that it is apartheid, that all those allegations stem from the 1960s in the Soviet Union. Can you please tell us about anti-Zionist activism or Zionology in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, how it spread around the world, and how it landed even in the United States and in our current time?
So this is a question that I usually take about 90 minutes to answer, but I'm going to be much briefer here. I'll do my best. So first I want to correct something in the question. Anti-Zionist activism. Anti-Zionist activism is what we have in America and Europe today, in the West. In the West today, anti-Zionism is really a product of grassroots or apparent grassroots initiative. There are, of course, others who work with it, manipulate it, etc. But it looks like activism. It takes the form of protests, etc. In the USSR, first of all, anti-Zionism was always part of state policy in the Soviet Union. But the period that we're talking about that's particularly relevant for this moment, from 1967 onward till the end of the Soviet Union, it was really state policy. The Soviet Union identified Zionism as one of its key ideological enemies, as a kind of that was hand in glove with American imperialism. And having identified it as such, the state drove the anti-Zionism in the USSR and in Soviet propaganda as it spread abroad. So why was 1967 such a key turning point? That's because we're talking here about the Six-Day War and Israel's victory over Soviet Arab allies in the Middle East. And because the Soviets had sponsored and financed these Arab states, they viewed their defeat as personal crisis, as kind of a crisis for the Soviet Union, for its bloc, for its sphere of influence. And with the Soviet Union being very much, it's a post-totalitarian culture, deeply authoritarian, deeply intransparent, conspiratorial narratives flow freely. The KGB very much are a conspiratorial kind of organization in the sense that they view the world in conspiratorial terms. And so when they try to understand what happened in June of 1967, they start to look around the world and they see that there are Jews everywhere in positions of influence in America. They see that there is a movement inside the Soviet Union by Jews who are inspired by this victory, who suddenly reconnect to their Jewish identity and want to emigrate to Israel. And they feel that they conclude that there is a global Zionist conspiracy, stretching from the United States, going all the way through underground into Russia and the Soviet Union. And this conspiracy is extremely anti-communist, anti-Soviet. It goes hand in hand with America. And so this is really the beginning of how they realize in their conspiratorial imagination that they need to be responding to this ideology everywhere. Because if Zionism is everywhere, then it needs to be fought everywhere. And so they begin to develop these ideas that equate Zionism with every evil under the sun, you could say, or certainly every evil from the point of view of progressive leftist, the point of view of leftist groups, because this is the groups that it's trying to bring into the fold and build. It's already built an ecosystem with them based on other propagandistic premises, and so they fold the anti-Zionist ideology into their anti-American, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist ideology, and they equate Zionism with racism, fascism, as you said, imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, genocide. All the topics that we see that seem so contemporary today, they already exist there. And why do they make this kind of extensive comparison, this extensive list of synonyms, right? This is Zionism equals all these terrible things. It's because they're trying to speak to many different groups, So to Europeans, they emphasize that Zionists are the new Nazis. When they speak to Africans, South Africans, they speak about Zionists as being racist. And also colonialist and imperialist, because this is a post-colonial era and this is what resonates there. So they're very sophisticated about it. They understand the segmenting of audiences, kind of basic marketing, basic propaganda, basic work with audiences. They get it. And so this is what they begin to spread. And it begins to really take to become adopted by the global left by the early 70s. Essentially by the early 70s, the global far left, socialists, Trotskyists, Black Panthers, the new left, they're all speaking in this language already. And it's a radical shift. They didn't before 1967. Before 67, there wasn't this conspiratorial approach to Zionism. After 67, it's very much there.
Yeah. I Hello?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes. I recognize that from the Netherlands where I was living at those times. Hello, kitty cat.
I apologize again for
No,
your listeners. My cat has decided to intervene, so I'm just going to remove
no
some
problem. No
things so
problem.
that
No problem.
there are some things that attracted her. So I'm
No
just going to
problem. No problem.
and then we can continue. Okay. I
Yes.
apologize.
So no problem. I recognize that from when I lived in the Netherlands in the 1960s, that before the Six-Day War, I only heard pro-Israel discourse. But after the Six-Day War, I heard very much anti-Zionist, like vehement anti-Zionist discourse coming from the left of all places. And that was
Yes.
not yet in the rest of society, but at the left, it was very much there. Later on, it went from there to basically everywhere in society.
Exactly. And I'll just add that, by 1970, I think in 1971, there is an article in the New York Times which already talks about how for the far left, essentially the anti-Zionist language is a new version of anti-Semitic, more acceptable version of anti-Semitic discourse. So, it's really significant because I used to wonder as I've been doing my research, for a while I thought that maybe all of this language wasn't really noticed by mainstream Jewish community, mainstream press, because I was asking myself, why is it here's this massive propaganda geared at the West? Why are people not noticing? So I thought maybe it was just limited to the far left. And then I realized that yes, in a way it was limited to the far left, but people did notice. Observers noticed, analysts noticed, the Jewish community noticed, senior leaders of the Jewish community noticed. In 1976, there was a meeting of the World Jewish Congress where they already heard, they already had a workshop on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And they heard from a delegation in Latin America. And Latin America, of course, was very strongly under the influence of the Soviets. So they already heard that for some of the Jews in Latin America, mentioning that they were pro-Israel or Zionist was very dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense, but they didn't do it because they prefer to be quiet because it evoked their negative responses. So it was already there, and we can maybe discuss why. The question that I always ask myself is, well, if people noticed it already in the 70s, why is it that every time there is something happening in Israel and Gaza, we all, the American Jewish community wakes up and says, where did this come from? I've never seen this before. What is this new anti-Semitism? Anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. Well, it hasn't been new for about 50 years or 60 years almost. So I think it's a really important question for us to answer ourselves. Why is it that we chose to sort of push it away and not deal with it as it kept popping up over the previous decades?
Do you have an answer? A possible answer?
Well, look, I think my answer is that I think it's extremely tempting to set aside these kind of difficult explosions of anti-Jewish sentiments. If it comes and goes, it seems, I think from the point of view of American Jews and diaspora Jews maybe, but I can speak only really for America. It's like there is, let's say there is an explosion. In 2014, there was an Israel-Gaza war. In 2021, there was one in May. But, it's like it comes and then it goes. And I think it's just people don't understand that it's all part of an ongoing, not only fight against Israel, but also information, psychological warfare against Jews more broadly. And so people think, well, okay, this is over now. This little war is over now. So now we can go back to our lives. But they don't think that way. The other side doesn't think that way. They're preparing for the next time this will happen, not only militarily, but also, again, from the point of view of psychological warfare. And I think it's a mentality that we really need to change. We really need to, especially after October 7th, I hope people have been shaken up enough to want to now invest into thinking strategically about what do we do when the next time happens, because the next time will happen. So it's just a lack of strategic thinking. I think there is also, for a very long time, American Jews thought that the greatest danger for Jews comes from the right. And I remember it myself because I think I first started warning about this growth of anti-Zionist tendencies in 2017, maybe 2018, something like that. And, people would read my articles and they would say, okay, interesting. Thanks for letting us know. We still worry about the right much more. That's where the Nazis are. And people just haven't been prepared they don't know the history. They haven't been taught the history of the Soviet Union, of Soviet Jewry. A lot of American Jews, I think, can more or less recreate what happened to Jews in Nazi Germany, right? What were the precursors to the Holocaust? What happened during the Holocaust and what happened after? People get a sense of that because there are so many films about it. There are obviously lots of books. There are personal connections, but family connections. But the Soviet part of the story and the story of what the left's relationship with the Jews really has remained untold pretty much, which again is interesting because, American Jews were so active in the Soviet Jewry movement for 2 generations, but they somehow did not retain that. They did not learn the lessons. They did not retain it in their collective history. They did not tell the story to their children. So that's, I think all of that sort of has come together to make people believe that anti-Zionism from the left, no, unpleasant, but not dangerous. And today we see, unfortunately, just how dangerous it is.
How did it come from the Soviet Union to the United States of all places?
Well, look, again, I think that it began. It became part of the left already in the 70s, right? But there were several channels. I've traced the channels through which this propaganda was
Hmm?
communicated. There were diplomatic channels. Soviet ambassadors, the long-serving Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin, received instruction to, this is in the 70s already, but he received instruction to go and work and communicate these ideas on the Hill, that Zionists were dangerous for America, that Zionists were undermining the American-Soviet relations. He received the instruction to go and speak to progressive Jews who were not Zionist or less Zionist than the mainstream community, and to tell them how dangerous Zionism was. So the Soviet diplomats worked on this around the globe. You know, we have examples also from London, from Paris. So that was one line. They worked with the media. They worked with the media that they sponsored. They sponsored a lot of left-wing media. And so what's interesting is you see it after 1967, how again, the tone of these left-wing publications really changes with regards to Israel and Zionism.
Yeah.
You know, if you were a communist, a Western communist at that time, you wouldn't have liked Zionism anyway. The main reason for that being that communists are internationalists and Zionists are nationalists. And so from the very beginning, the Soviets argued, the Bolsheviks argued, you know, Lenin, Stalin argued that Zionists are they're wrong in many ways in the way they view the world, and certainly because they're nationalists. You know, the way they're trying to sell the nationalist idea to the Jewish masses in Russia is a mistaken approach. The correct approach is internationalism. I think if people listen carefully, if people have paid attention, they would recognize that this is in a way the message of the left today as well. You know, they don't argue this from the point of view of class theory, right, and class struggle. It comes today from the neo-Marxist views, kind of that look at the world from the positions of race, color of the skin, and various fixed features, right? The oppressor-oppressed binary we say today. I mean, Marxism is also preoccupied with oppressor-oppressed binary, but it's based on class struggle. So and then after 67, what happens then is that conspiratorial tropes enter the discourse about Israel and Zionism. Until then, the left was the anti-Zionist left really grounded its anti-Zionist ideas in Marxist theory. After 67, and it begins with Stalin. It's just, you know, to be clear, it begins with Stalin. It's just that after 67, it becomes really deeply developed and really big and widespread, is that the conspiratorial view of Zionism, the idea that Zionists are everywhere, that Zionists operate not just in Israel, but that they are everywhere, and wherever they are, there are problems, and they are against socialists and communists and against Soviet interests. That is a conspiratorial idea that matches. It matches nothing in reality, but it matches the tropes of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is, of course, the fundamental text of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And this is how you know that once anti-Zionism starts to use those tropes, this is when it enters anti-Semitic territory with 100% certainty, because once you can replace the word Jews with the word Zionists, but when the tropes are there, people recognize them. You know, these tropes about Jews, Jewish influence, Jewish control of finances and media and politics sit so deeply in our conscience or consciousness that people recognize them immediately. And so they respond to these tropes from a place of fear, from a place of a lot of it is fear. A lot of it is a belief that, well, Jews are going to control the world and subvert our societies. Well, now it's Zionists are going to control the world and subvert our societies. And we hear that today very much in the idea that, for example, that Israel controls America, apparently, to such an extent that poor America couldn't make its own decisions. Israel, a country the size of New Jersey, dragged the entire superpower into war with Iran. It's like America has zero agency. There's this this shadow force, dark force manipulating America from the background. Zionists have occupied America. These are your classic anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes. And this is what the Soviets are starting to spread after 1967, starting with 1967.
Is it true that the Soviet regime also recycled Nazi propaganda about Jews in the 1960s?
They did. They very much looked at what the Nazis were saying, how they were saying it. You can see, they wanted to be very careful. They didn't want to be identified with the Nazis because their self-image was very much built around the victory over Nazis. I
Yeah.
mean, to this day, right, Russia talks about how we defeated the Nazis, therefore we can't possibly be anti-Semitic, we can't possibly be against Jews. It's like this legitimacy that goes back to 1945. But they do use the tropes, and they actually appear in some of the Soviet propaganda films. There's an infamous Soviet propaganda film that actually used footage from an infamous Nazi film about Jews. I think it's The Wandering Jew. They borrowed footage from there. And yeah, look, to the extent that the Nazis borrowed the tropes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the Soviets very much borrowed their ideas from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Nazi propaganda was present there. And the Zionologists, it's a somewhat ironic Soviet term. There was a couple dozen people who really were central to the building of this ideology. They were called Zionologists. They were very close and employed by, central Soviet kind of apparatus, by the Communist Party, by the KGB. So a lot of them were closet Nazi worshippers, closet fascists, kind of neo-fascists. So they spoke in the language of Marxism-Leninism because this is what the ideology required. But their own views were actually very, very far right. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, or even before that, when the perestroika started, when the reform began in 1985, and the ideological controls loosened, a lot of them emerged into this anti-Semitic culture that rose to the surface during that period.
In the 1960s and 70s, the Netherlands, where I'm from, was very pro-Israel. And when I went to university in Amsterdam at the end of the 70s, I landed in an anti-Zionist environment for the first time. In the 1980s, that had spread to Dutch cultural life, and in the 1990s to the media, and then to most of the Dutch population. Did the first anti-Zionism in the Netherlands, which was at the universities, come from the Soviet Union? And is it true what the defected Soviet journalist Yuri Bezmenov said in an interview, that the Soviets considered influencing the minds of university students in the West as the key to subvert Western societies?
Well, look, the answer to the second question is an absolute yes. That's 100% true. I find it fascinating that you already noticed that the anti-Zionist culture was there in the universities in the 1970s and spread to the wider culture in the 1980s, because that is exactly what happened. Now, was it all from the Soviet Union? I would need to examine it closer. I don't know the Dutch situation so well. Look, there could have been several spheres of influence. There could have been Arab students coming to Dutch universities, and I don't know if there were many. Palestinian students, for example, in Germany, there were a lot of Palestinian students, certainly in East Germany. But I would say that I would guess that, look, I think there was a lot of Arab propaganda, largely, I think, running out of Egypt. They had very strong apparatus. But I think the power that articulated the anti-Zionist ideas the most and in the most articulate way was the Soviet Union. So I would look there. I would look at definitely at what were the influences, what were the connections.
Yeah,
Uh,
there were connections in academia. There were connections with trade unions. There were
okay, well,
connections with the peace movement.
Well, this is exactly it. You see, I've looked at the British left and I've looked at what the British left was consuming and putting out in the 1970s and 80s. And there you can see very clearly that there were connections, both with Palestinian groups, the PLO, etc., and the Soviet Union. But the PLO also, I'm always hesitant to just say that. Look, I just don't think that the PLO was producing its own ideas in the same kind of to the same kind of depth that the Soviets were, because the Soviets recruited their academic structures. They definitely were pursuing connections with other countries through academic channels and trade unions. 100%. That was also a vector of influence in the UK. There was a there was a I apologize. I now hear my cat meowing again. Do you think it will? Should I try to stop him or
No, no, that
just continue? Okay.
no, fine.
Um, so there were a whole bunch of front organizations, international front organizations that essentially presented, not essentially, but they became channels of Soviet influence. And so there was a worldwide trade union organization. I don't remember its exact name, but it was very powerful, very influential. It published its own publications in multiple languages. And so even though, why do we call it a front? Because for its audiences, for its members, I think it had, I don't know, probably millions of members around the globe. For its members, it was supposed to be pursuing the interests or representing the interests of the working class, right? Trade unions. But in reality, they were there to channel Soviet interests, to Soviet foreign policy agendas. So yes, so if the trade unions were strong, then that would have been a channel of influence. If the left in general was strong, then that would have been a channel of influence, because the Soviets, and this is well documented, they channeled significant sums of money to the European left. So, and if you were received publications, you were on the left, you received, or if you received money from the Soviet Union, then you were also publishing you were producing publications that also then had to communicate the Soviet point of view. Again, you see it over and over again. The countries that I've examined show that that was the pattern. So I wouldn't be surprised that that would have been the source.
Yeah,
So
and I have this deja vu today in the United States where I see, for instance, teachers' unions being so anti-Zionist and
yes,
influencing American education at K to 12.
yes,
Very anti-Zionist. Even many hang maps on the wall in the classroom where Israel it doesn't even show Israel anymore.
yes.
I see a deja vu with the university environment in the United States today being so anti-Zionist. The
Mhm.
Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. It obviously cannot be pushed by the Soviet Union, but maybe the mechanisms by which it is spread, the money coming from abroad, in this case, Qatar, for instance, a large money stream from Qatar to universities, to education, that it's somehow working in the same way as it used to work in the 70s and 80s, coming from the Soviet Union.
Well, that's exactly right. Look, often people will say, well, the Soviet Union is not there anymore. Why do we still have it? But if you think about it, Nazi Germany hasn't been around for 80 years, but Nazi ideology is still very much with us,
Right.
right? ideas like this, all it takes is for somebody, for enthusiasts to continue perpetuating them. So the Soviet Union hasn't been around for 35 years, but guess what? There's still even people around who were influenced by the Soviet Union back then, who are still around today propagating the same ideas. Angela Davis is the first example. You know, she was a communist and an anti-Zionist during the Cold War. She was extremely prominent in the global left-wing movement, in the global ecosystem that the Soviets tried to influence very heavily. And by the way, one of the channels was various youth festivals that they organized around the world with the help of their front organizations, where they would push these ideas, these political agendas. And already in 1973, you see the anti-Zionist agenda being part of a World Youth Festival that took place in East Berlin in 1973. Arafat came there. That's where, by the way, Angela Davis met Yasser Arafat for the first time. I've seen footage of Palestinians being there and the Soviets really advancing their ideas and slogans. So, so it's already there. And I think once you implant certain ideas, so Angela Davis is number one. There is a bunch of Brits who were around Jeremy Corbyn, who also come out of that ecosystem. You see George Galloway, if your audiences know who he is. He, by the way, comes out of the trade union background, rabidly anti-Zionist and anti-Israel in that kind of conspiratorial way. He was already so in the 1980s, I think, is when I saw him mentioned in some left-wing press, taking these very, again, conspiratorial positions about Zionism and Israel. And so, the people who were influenced by that ecosystem, who were part of that ecosystem, are still with us. There are people in Finland who are still with us, who adopted these ideas. And so I think that what happened is that, look, the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. It stops sponsoring and pushing this agenda. It turns inward for about, I would say, for about a decade. It doesn't really peddle this theme very actively. Russia restores relations with Israel. Ukraine does the same, but then, and I think 1990s are an interesting time, because I was on American campuses in the 1990s and I don't remember anything like it. And so my theory that I'm sort of developing is that there was sort of an interlude in the 1990s. The money wasn't there for this propaganda to be pushed. But the ideas didn't go away. The ideas were there. They were published. Remember, everything there are articles, there are books written advocating this point of view. So then the new money comes in the early 2000s. We have the conference in Durban, South Africa, right? We have 9/11. We have Second Intifada. And this is when new actors come in who are willing to give money, to put money into this anti-Israel struggle. The jihadists begin to conquer the West. We have Students for Justice in Palestine who actually, the first chapter was opened in the 1990s, but it didn't get developed. It all starts to gather speed in the early 2000s. But the thing about it is that the ideas remain the same. The language remains the same, because why reinvent the language? The Soviets really created this industrial strength anti-Zionist language. You can't match it. You can't reinvent it, and you can't match it with anything else that you would come up on your own. And this is where the influence is. The money may be different. The actors are different. By the way, Russia is now back in this influence game. It doesn't have the same resources that it had in Soviet times. But it has the ideas are there. It's written the playbook. They have the language, and that's what really influences the masses.
In 1979, when I was a student in Amsterdam, I traveled to the Soviet Union. Many Jewish students in Europe did that to support Jewish life there, which was suppressed heavily by the Soviets. And Jewish life was pretty much underground. I was impressed by the fearless Jewish pride of the Jews there, how they were involved in studying and teaching each other Jewish culture and Zionism, even Hebrew. I spoke with a physics professor in Moscow who was fired because he had applied to emigrate to Israel and who now was working as a window cleaner. He asked me where I had been in Jerusalem and in which part of Jerusalem my family lived, and he knew all the streets there. So it turned out he had never been to Israel, but he knew the whole map of Jerusalem. I was so impressed by that. Then I landed at a gathering of Jewish Zionists, and they were loudly singing Israeli and Jewish songs with the windows wide open so that the police outside even could hear it. And they said, okay, it may cause a raid, but they kept singing. Do you recognize this pride and fearlessness of Jews in the Soviet Union at the time?
Well, look, this is something that we know about the refusenik culture. These are the people you met with. And first of all, thank you for going. I thank everyone who participated in this movement. It was incredibly important and incredibly meaningful. And today, as a grown up living in the West, I understand how much effort it takes to go out and do something like this and protest and demonstrate and certainly travel to the Soviet Union to help your people in the name of Jewish peoplehood, really. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. Um, the people you met with didn't characterize all Soviet Jews because they were activists. They were people who applied to emigrate from the Soviet Union and were refused. And to be refused, as you say, meant to be marginalized, expelled from your workplace, fired from your workplace, expelled from your university. And what this group of Jews did is they turned to Jewish learning, because they didn't have jobs. They had to have some kind of menial jobs because in the USSR, everybody was obligated to have a job. Otherwise, you were called a parasite and it was illegal. And so they would do these, like they would sweep streets, or they would. Many of them loved the job of a night guard because it was quiet and they could sit there and study Hebrew while they were guarding some Soviet bureaucratic building. Um, but they really dedicated their time to studying, to learning about Israel. What you describe about streets, it's very characteristic of what they did and how they learned and how they tried to connect with Israel because they couldn't travel there, of course. But they would put together slideshows based on postcards from Israel or whatever maps they could find. It's important to understand that it wasn't even easy to come by any of this knowledge. It's not something you could just go and grab somewhere easily. But yeah, this kind of the intimate knowledge of Israeli cities is really just truly fascinating. But yeah, they found that they wanted to learn Hebrew because they thought that this is a crucial part of Jewish identity that they had been deprived of. And Hebrew teachers were viewed as the KGB viewed them as extremely dangerous because they were spreading Jewish consciousness, because you can't learn a language without also learning culture, learning about the country, and it really strengthens your identity. And so they were very much persecuted. So yes, so the pride and the defiance that you noticed very much characterized that group, the refusenik activists, openly. But I would say that all Soviet Jews probably the majority of Soviet Jews had a sense of Jewish pride anyway. Even if we, in my family, we were not refuseniks. My dad always tried to counter Soviet propaganda at home, but we were not openly dissidents. And yet, we knew that the sense of Jewish pride was always there. And this is actually something that, and not just pride, but defiance, really, because when you're surrounded by a culture that is demonizing everything related to Israel and Zionism, and then ultimately it triggers demonization of everything Jewish. And by then, anyway, by the 70s and 80s, when I was growing up, there was so little of Jewish culture and observance left. You really didn't know what it meant to be a Jew in kind of deeper ways. But the you're surrounded by that. And the only way to really survive it, I would say almost psychologically, not necessarily physically. I don't think we necessarily felt in danger physically, but to survive it psychologically, you had to be defiant. You had to be able to say to yourself, this is bullshit. I don't buy this. This is propaganda. I'm not going to let this affect me. I'm not going to let this affect how I think of myself, how I think of being Jewish, how I think about Jewish peoplehood. And so, that's why I wrote the book. I want to show it to those who are watching us on
Yes,
video.
please do.
The book "Be a Refusenik: A Jewish Student Survival Guide," with the foreword by Natan Sharansky, who is probably the most famous Refusenik activist. Because I wanted, really, the main message of this book that I wanted to communicate is the importance of defiance in the face of really the psychological warfare that we're facing as Jews, all of us. It's not just geared against Israel; it's geared against all of us.
Yes, I don't want to say that the climate we are living in as Jews in the West these days is identical to what Jews in the Soviet Union have endured, but there is a lot of criticism of Zionism, of Israel. There is a lot of delegitimization of a Jewish state. There is a lot of anger towards Jews, also for being Jewish. There is a lot of canceling of Jews going on.
Exactly.
So to stay positive and defiant is maybe something we need to do as well today, correct?
I think it's really important. And look, I'm very careful in the book. I explain that, of course, what we have in America today isn't the same. America of 2026 isn't Brezhnev's USSR. You can't make that literal comparison.
No.
And Jews aren't living in the same. In the end, America is a free country, and this is really a decisive, the most important difference. But what's similar is the culture, the anti-Zionist culture, the demonization. It's, of course, it's bigger than criticism. You can address criticism, but we're talking about demonization
Correct.
of Zionism, that ultimately it doesn't stop with Zionism. Just, as I said already years ago, it doesn't stop with Zionism. It continues and broadens to all Jews. It doesn't matter in the end what your thoughts about Zionism and Israel are. And we've seen this happen already with some of the most prominent anti-Zionist Jews like Peter Beinart and others, where they are being attacked by their comrades who are essentially telling them, okay, fine, you condemn Zionism, but it's not enough. It's really, it's the religion, it's Judaism. That's what it's fault. That's what's at fault. So, it never ends. If you're a Jew and you want to say, look, I'm on the good side of history, look, I'm not Zionist, I don't go to Israel, don't touch me. But it just never ends there. And I say it from, both. It's so well documented. That's the thing. It's like part of the reason to know Soviet history or Soviet Jewish history is to know that this is so well documented, that these are the processes and this is what happens. And so the similarity is that kind of symbolic similarity of a Jewish community being attacked with the language of anti-Zionism that came from the Soviet Union. And so that's why in the book, my thought in writing the book was that if the form of attack is similar, then it makes sense also to look at the patterns of resistance. How did these young Soviet Jewish activists, and they were young at the time, we have to remember, they were in their 20s, their 30s at the oldest end mostly, some were like 17 or 18. How did they respond? And I think, the response that matters almost more than actual kind of what they did in real life is the kind of the internal work that has to happen in order to realize, they're trying to really disconnect you from, they're trying to get you to denounce Jewish people, to disconnect you from Jewish peoplehood, to disconnect you from your Jewish identity. And I'm not going to let them do it. So this is where what the source of lessons is here. And in the book, I match the stories of the refuseniks, the refusnik activists, with stories of young American activists, Jewish activists today, because I genuinely found that both sets of activists actually embark on sort of similar inner journeys, because neither one of them, Sharansky didn't enter college thinking that he would become a Zionist activist and eventually become a hero of the Jewish people. He didn't plan on going to the Gulag, and spending 9 years at the Gulag. And young activists today, very similarly, it comes through in every story. They became reluctant activists in the sense that they didn't plan to enter college to sue their universities for anti-Semitism. They didn't plan to be fighting their universities because of their failure to protect Jewish students. But this is what life pushed them towards. And when they faced that, I call it the burning bush moment, when they faced that moment of truth, that burning bush that tells them that this is a mission, they could walk on by, but it's their mission really. And so they take it on. And I think that journey is very similar, and in the similarity of that journey are really the main lessons of the book.
I think it's extremely helpful for all of us to read your book, so that we can learn and be inspired by the the Jewish movement, the Zionist movement of Jews in the Soviet Union at the time, and as we are dealing with similar mechanisms in our times today, we can learn a tremendous lot from them. And you documented it so and explained it so well in your book. So I can and fully recommend to read your book.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Um, we have come to the end of this interview. Thank you, Isabella, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Our listeners can order Isabella Tabarovsky's book, Be a Refusenik, a Jewish Student's Survival Guide, on Amazon. You can find former episodes of this podcast at the Never Again Is Now podcast channels on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeart. And I thank our listeners for listening, and please speak up against anti-Zionism whenever you come across it. And Isabella, thank you very, very much for this interview.
And thank you, Evelyn, for having me. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.